Hello and welcome back to the News Project on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the News Director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, July the 2nd. We're continuing today with our series of in-depth interviews with the leading candidates for Vermont's governorship, and today it's our pleasure to welcome to our virtual studio Mr. John Klar, who is a farmer, an attorney, and a writer who lives up in Brookfield, Vermont. He is running for the Republican Party's nomination for the governorship, and it will be his first try for public elected office. Although he's been a commentator and an opinion writer for several political websites and publications here in Vermont. Mr. Klar, welcome to the News Project, and thank you very much for making the time to talk with us today and share your views about some of the major issues you see confronting Vermont.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm honored.
Well, let's jump right into it. And I guess the obvious starting point here for us is what prompted you to run for the governorship? Was there some issue or another that made you think, this is my turn to throw my hat in the ring here?
Well, some of us on the conservative end of Vermont's Republican spectrum have felt that Governor Scott has not been very representative of our views, particularly on the gun bill. And then last year when he signed the abortion bill, rather than just let it pass, he actually kind of snubbed a lot of people that were conservatives by actually signing the thing. And that prompted me to be very, very concerned, because in 2018, at the encouragement of party experienced veterans in the GOP, I was told that I should vote for Phil Scott. They called it the Phil Scott clothespin. So I did, and many of our people stayed home. And so we lost a lot of House and Senate seats because of the discouragement of the conservative base. And for us to do this again after the abortion bill, it was evident to me and others that this was going to lead to another stay-at-home year for the Vermont conservatives. So we felt it was important to galvanize people around a message that was central to our values. And in the course of that, I actually had no intention, so I smile, I had no intention of running. I actually had another person who was willing to run. We got a lot of momentum behind it, and then she decided it was too much for various reasons, including, personal reasons. And so I agreed to step up. So that's how I got called out of the woods. I was actually living off grid at the time. I have a law degree. I have a tax background. I know what farming is. I'm a regular old Vermonter, whatever that is. And so I just decided that, well, somebody needs to challenge this party and bring a set of policies that matter to all Vermonters before the voters in 2020. And here we are.
So you've been identified as a so-called ag-Republican, which I gather is a combo of agriculture and Republican. But I wonder if you could explain a little bit about what the philosophy of ag-Republicans are. You touched on a few points there just a moment ago, but I'm assuming the agriculture side of that is kind of a big deal for you folks as well.
Well, it is, and I'm proud and happy to say we have a number of farmers who have stepped forward to run as part of our group. And it was intended for several purposes, and part of it, now you say the philosophy, it's really the history, because we're not using that term anymore, as I'll explain. But first I'll explain why you're correct as to the philosophy. So the challenge was to start a movement within the GOP that differentiated me and those with me from Phil Scott, and offered voters-specific policies. The GOP platform, which we didn't want to be in conflict with, is rather generic. And voters want to know, A, that they can trust you, and B, what you're going to do. So we identified a policy list that we thought would unify a bunch of people, and that was also part of it, that instead of a whole bunch of people going in different directions, we had over 1,200 bills introduced this year in our legislature. We wanted to present a united front where we were going to say, well, we're going to focus on these top issues, and we'll all do it together and sort of form an inner leadership. And it became apparent very quickly that it was either confusing for people, or that those particularly loyalists to Phil Scott characterized what we were doing as a third-party movement. And it was not a third-party movement. So we said, okay, so we dropped the ag-Republicans name. But the name was meant to identify a specific set of policies which are built around farming and small businesses, which are now set forth on my website, Klar2020.com, up in the upper right corner, the Farming Manifesto. is what it's called. And it's about helping small farms and businesses and sort of reversing the decline of agriculture that's been going on for 100 years in Vermont. That's
How
part
do
of
you,
the broader plan.
what do you think the state's role should be in reversing that decline in agriculture? I mean, we all know the dairy industry in Vermont has been struggling for the past couple of years. Low milk prices have forced several of the dairy farmers, certainly down our way here in southern Vermont, out of business, or just really made it hard for them to make a go of it. And I'm sure that's the case elsewhere around the state. What specifically should the state do? Is it a question of simply offering more subsidies of some sort or another just to keep them going until times improve? Or what would be your strategy if elected governor to help those farmers who are, having a hard time making a living?
Excellent question, and actually allows me to highlight why it is that my skill set are unique for Vermont in this time. As Wendell Berry, an author I'm very fond of, and I'm trying to pick up his baton for Vermont, has been saying for many decades, the whole nation laments the loss of small farms, but that lamentation seems to do little to stem that decline. First of all, we must get over the concept of seeing dairy, and especially large dairy, as the only aspect of farming. Farming is an industry of sorts. It's a market. It has changed a lot. Vermont is #1 locavore state in the country. We have a huge amount of local produce that we could be growing and exporting that we're not. And so the answer as to what government can do, well, I certainly question the long-term dysfunction of government subsidizing a losing business model in large confinement dairy operations, and I'm not at all against them. But government would have a better role of getting out of farmers' way, just like it would have a better role staying out of teachers' way, out of doctors' way, and out of citizens' way, and out of the rest of our way. The government has grown so big in this state, however well-intentioned, that sometimes, like many economies of scale, it's counterproductive. And nowhere is that more obvious than in farming, where the 2020 plan of the Department of Agriculture is to spend $25 million to hire 22 more people to work at the Department of Agriculture, when we've lost 30 farms in the last 3 months, I believe, of the larger dairies. We have thousands of small farms that aren't on the radar there. The Agriculture Department does have some programs to advance them as far as marketing and distribution improvements. We also have a lot of young people who want to farm, and we have a tax burden for our property taxes that is cost prohibitive and disproportionately impacts farm producers. And so we want to compensate for that, not to subsidize farms, but to remove what's really a burdensome impediment. When farmland is appraised at its highest development value, you can't make a productive good out of it without getting a huge price for your product or finding those markets. And so both expanding the markets, reducing the regulations, reducing the tax burden through tax credits, property and income tax credits, we could bolster farms. And so in answer to your question, we've been doing this for decades. When we lose farms, we lose ancillary businesses, we lose feed dealers, equipment dealers, mechanics, all of the businesses that feed off of farming. Wendell Berry has written about this since the 60s. When we restore farms, those very businesses all can thrive. When we reduce the regulations that affect farms, we'll be reducing some of the overreaching of Act 250 and other things to help all small businesses. And if we reduce government waste, we help all Vermonters and all businesses and all farmers. That's, in a nutshell, the entire #1, if not our entire economic platform. Thank you for indulging me.
Oh, no problem. It's interesting to hear. I guess I'd like to just pivot to another area here that I'm sure is one that you've thought a lot about, and that's the question around the future of Vermont's small state colleges. As you know, this past spring there was some concern that a couple of those campuses up your way there, Northern Vermont University might be forced to close or shut down in some way or another. Large outcry greeted that proposal, and I guess my sense of it is that plan has been shelved for now, but there does seem to be a lot of money that would be needed to keep some of those campuses open, at least until better times arrive or maybe more students arrive. I guess I'm just wondering, again, if elected, what would be your approach to helping those small colleges that are apparently struggling at the moment? Should they get more money just to keep them going, or what?
Well, I like that you asked one of the more difficult questions our state faces, because in our top issues, we're actually willing to do that. You know, when we deal with the pensions, we're taking on one of the more complex and difficult issues, Act 46 in schools. That's part of, I think, what's getting people's attention. We're actually willing to talk about these issues. And the schools for the colleges is another one. And I think historically, Vermont maybe could have invested more in its higher education, but like so many real life factors, even government needs to be responsive to the reality on the ground. So I'm a big supporter of these institutions. My son went to Linden State. My wife recertified to become an RN at VTC, which until recently was the place for the whole state for nurse recertification, and has a wonderful nursing program. And we desperately need more nurses. One of the reasons our medium-sized hospitals are in trouble is we're bringing in per diem nurses from out of state on a long-term basis. So we have a crisis in our mental health system. We now, COVID, have had all of these things highlighted, including the colleges, and I connect them because they're connected. I was just having a conversation earlier with someone who wanted to do something about student loan forgiveness. And I said, well, that reminds me of a book called The Culture of Contentment by economist John Kenneth Galbraith, who was criticizing trickle-down economics as allocating wealth to the upper middle class through tax breaks. If we pay for colleges, we're largely paying for an upper middle class aspiration, while our trade schools, including some of the things in these colleges we're talking about, are maybe left underfunded or empty. What we need in Vermont is more mechanics, more electricians, more sheetrockers, and I'm not suggesting necessarily allocate one to the other, but I think these institutions can both find cost savings, but find ways to be subsidized that at least will give us a return on investment. We could have more promotion for more students. But I think that there's a market aspect in which, you know, like VTC, I believe, has a very high placement rate for graduates. So, you know, not being an expert, I actually reached out before their announced closure to the new president of VTC. I think she's been about a year there, and I had not heard back from her. They also are integrated with agricultural projects there at VTC. So I don't know that it's a one size fits all, but I do think we need to revamp them and do more than just continue paying $20 million or whatever the figure is to keep them going, and then face the same problem again, you know, 6 months or a year down the road. Because however well-intentioned we are, math matters, and we have to pay for this, you know, as just like pensions and some of the other things, we can't just kick the can. So complex issue, as with many other issues. You know, one of the things I've been doing is putting groups of people together that have the expertise and experience to do that. I'm not quite sure what all the details of the plan would be, but I think there's a blended response. But I think we definitely need to keep supporting those schools, but make them more efficient, both in costs and in the return we get from them. I think there's a way to make them more marketable and more profitable.
And I wanted to build on a point you made in the course of that answer there about those unfunded pension liabilities. We have, as I understand, about 4.5 billion with a B dollars of unfunded pension liabilities that the legislature has basically nibbled away at, I suppose, is one way of looking at it. But to some degree, they are also, kind of. There's been too many other pressing, I guess, financial obligations to tackle that directly. I guess again, if you're elected, would you be able to? Would you be wanting to come up with a plan right away, or make that a priority to start retiring some of those pension liabilities, or is that a case where that's just such a complicated and expensive problem that we're still going to have to wait a while before we confront that head on?
I see you have some insights into the problem, and I apologize for that. I'm actually in Barton near my old farm, and that was one of my old neighbors stopped and saw me, so I'm going to go visit him afterwards. So I apologize. I was listening.
Okay.
I love that you've hit the issue because, first of all, I'll demonstrate why it is having my training as a tax attorney and in accounting and economics comes readily into play in the pensions. I've been studying this since last year, and this should be a bipartisan issue. David Coates has written about it for years. Many people have written about it. The true number is not $4.5 billion. The $4.5 billion number, which has been stated and used, is a fiction based on fraud. It's based on using all existing investments for our teachers and state employees' accounts, earning almost 8% a year for the next 30 years. And anyone will tell you that's a fantasy. Furthermore, it underestimates future growth in the cost of these plans because we see healthcare costs rising at 15% a year, and that's not the projection they're using, I assure you. The true number before COVID was probably at least $6 to $7 billion. For every 1% you reduce that proposed income figure on existing investments, you add $600 million to the deficiency. So if instead of earning 7% or 7.25% for the next 30 years, we in fact earned, a more reasonable market return of 4%, that would add $1.8 billion to that figure before we looked at the increased costs that are skyrocketing through the healthcare crisis. But now we've had COVID, so now we've probably lost principal value in existing investments. We're not going to see 4%. We've lost principal, and what is our future income? We don't know. So the true number is probably at least $9 or $10 billion. But $5 billion is enough because $5 billion already put us in the red. And when the state of Vermont was compelled to account properly for those pension deficiencies, we suddenly became basically an illiquid entity. We had more liabilities than we had assets as a state. That's how big it is. So it's extraordinarily complex, and it requires a very complex answer. I'm not going to fix it overnight. First thing I would propose to do is accurately measure the numbers so we're honest with our teachers and our taxpayers and our students. Second of all, I would want to sit down with the sometimes rather uncooperative unions and find out from them how they propose to protect their own retirement. As a fiscal conservative, I also was raised by teachers and almost became one. I believe in teachers. They forego salaries to get good retirement benefits. So do the state workers who drive truck. So we owe them the money. And talking about it is having the integrity to say we want to fund the pensions. So yes, we're making it a priority to fund them, but we also have to get a grip on costs, just like we're discussing, with the colleges and the healthcare costs. You can't just look the other way and go, oh, well, we'll deal with that next year. I mean, we have declining numbers of students, and Act 250 or Act 46 has increased our costs. What are we going to do long term when we've lost 25% of our students? It's not sustainable any more than environmental degradation. So the pensions have a multiple response, and it would mean perhaps considering some conversions of the structure of the plan. Other states have converted to 401ks and other defined contribution plans. There are many different tools available, and smarter people and economists from both sides than I have been proposing and talking about this for years. We know what we need to do. We have to have the fortitude to do it. Sorry for that long-winded answer, but that's a tough nut to crack right there.
Oh, I totally understand. Yes, it is the fact that it's been battered around for so many years at this point is testimony, I guess, to the fact that it is a complex issue and no easy answers there. Let me turn to another complex issue, and that's Act 250 and the revision that's been proposed for it, as well as perhaps in the time we have left, some of the other issues that are around the environmental area. Do you think the legislature should be revising Act 250? And if so, how would you like to see them revise it? Or is it a law that should be left more or less as it is?
Well, let me make an analogy. We started out in, I think, 1913 with a rather simple personal income tax code. And the income tax code and the regulations are now so enormous that it would probably boggle most Americans' minds to know just how many fine print pages there are. Because when we create policy issues, then people find ways to circumvent them. So then we need to find more policy issues to circumvent that. So then we get into such a huge, burdensome complexity of regulations, whatever the area of law is, that it starts to become, once again, a drag. And Act 250, like current use, well-intentioned, has burgeoned into having so many layers and sometimes trying to circumvent abuses that it creates new abuses. And Act 250 needs to be pared back. They have cut it back a little bit from their original plans this year, but they've been looking to extend it further and further into the livelihoods of farmers. And so that's actually the big picture issue, the conversation I'd like to discuss for both sides of the aisle is, Act 250 can be the best intentioned thing in the world. And I support its original intentions, and it has probably protected Vermont in many ways. But when you become the 49th worst state in the country to do business in, when the costs of compliance are so huge, and when Act 250 is used to forestall or prevent things like, small, tiny business. One I saw used against last year, they've been there 20 years. It's a sporting goods shop. They were told suddenly, retroactively, they needed to get Act 250 compliance. $10,000 in legal fees to do what we knew they could do anyway, because they've been doing it 20 years. There was a midwifery clinic that was refused access to open in Randolph because they had to go through Act 250. It's absurd. So it's time to pare it back so that it's in balance. And I use another parallel. Under the 3-acre rule in the Rutland area, the state of Vermont wants to impose on businesses a requirement to resurface any area over 3 acres. They estimate this is going to cost $300 million for Rutland. They haven't provided the money. So you could have a well-intentioned desire to clean up the lake, and without looking at how much pollution we generate resurfacing all of those areas, because that seems to be excluded from the calculation, where does the $300 million come from? And just like healthcare and other things, we have to be able to afford well-intentioned ideas. Act 250 has become extremely economically burdensome to our small businesses and others who should be protected, not buried in something that doesn't yield any productive growth other than for bureaucrats. So that's my answer on 250.
There's a long conversation we could probably have around environmental questions. I know you've been critical of the Global Warming Solution Act that the legislature recently passed along, and that might be another question we could talk about at another time. But in the few minutes we have left, I just wanted to ask you one other question on a current topic that's attracted a lot of interest and attention, and that's the whole issue around defunding the police is, I guess, the catchword term that's been employed, and the Black Lives Matter question about police enforcement in the state not being equal to all. What is your takeaway on that? Do you feel like the police departments, maybe should have some of their budget money redirected to like social service agencies, like mental health agencies and the like? Some have suggested that those folks have more training and background to deal with some of the issues that the police are forced to deal with in the course of their work, but maybe don't have the right kind of training to do. What is your feeling about all of that?
My thinking, hopefully. So it's even actually compounded by the way it's presented. Is it an either or? So it's one thing to say, absolutely, we need more funding for mental health and abuse counseling services, family relations, all of those things should not be diminished. I don't know why they would have to be at the expense of the police. It would be a matter of just appropriate budgeting. Just, as a matter of we are going to defund the police. No, I think it's craziness. Police, as much as we don't like corrupt police, we need good police, and we're discouraging them right now by not standing up for those police who do recognize our constitutional rights, even when some people are treating them horribly, trying to kill them or just spitting on them. Those people don't get paid a lot of money, and the good cops are ones that we need to reward, not punish them for the behavior of bad police behavior. I was a criminal defense attorney for years. I have seen police corruption, and I have seen police be outstanding servants of both us and our Constitution and make sacrifices that most people just don't give them credit for, and they're not allowed to speak up about it. So I think it's an emotional thing that people are feeling that somehow they're going to have some magical response to police brutality by switching money around. It doesn't work that way. And I'd give one example. I've seen a shift in police attitudes in Vermont over the last few years that I commend them for having an increased sensitivity and strategy and compassion for people that are substance abusers. The heroin and fentanyl epidemic, that has shifted the whole police response for most police. And that's a good thing. So there are a lot of programs where we can improve policing without defunding policing. We don't want to leave them unprepared. And I do believe that Vermont's police overall have a very good record, and it's been distorted by allegations that they're racist based solely on arrest rates. Just because you'll arrest more black people than white people versus your underlying demographic does not mean that you're arresting them because they're black. They could actually be guilty. We had a recent high-profile case of a guy that was deported back here from Jamaica after 2 years on the lam after murdering a woman in Burlington. He's black. You put him in jail, you've just caused a spike in Vermont's rate of black people versus white in prison. I guess our police are racist. Or was he guilty? And that issue, that research, because I don't show that I know the answer, nobody's looking at that. You know, how many of these people are guilty? How many people are coming here from out of state with criminal records, transporting drugs? Am I being racist? Nope. I was an inner city criminal defense attorney. I know where the drugs come from. I'm a recovery coach for the state of Vermont. The fentanyl, you can track it by the deaths, where it comes from. It comes from Mexico. So it's very unfair to our police to presume a racist intention. Of course, we should fight racist police or official behavior at any point. We always have. We always should. And we already have a standard and provisions for that. Sorry about the long-winded answer.
Well, that's okay.
It was a compound question.
Oh, I know. Yes, it's a complex issue, no question. Boy, we could probably talk for another half an hour easily, Mr. Klar. Unfortunately, we're out of time at the moment, but I see you're going to be coming down to the Manchester area later this month, I believe the 25th of July. You're making a stop here. It makes me wonder, it must be interesting doing a campaign for the governorship during a pandemic when it's hard to kind of get out and do the usual knock on doors and meet folks in person kind of thing that's typically characterizes a political campaign. But are you
Well,
able
it's good
to
get back out and meet people again. I can tell you, I'm definitely I like face-to-face, and I don't want anybody to get sick, but I think a lot of us are excited to get out and from both parties to show Vermonters normalcy. That yes, we're going to have a campaign again. We're going to have a little red-blue discussion, and then we're going to move on with life, and we're going to try to be neighbors, despite COVID.
All right. Well, again, we have to leave it there for now, but thank you for making the time out of a busy day, I can see, and to share your views with us about the issues. And who knows, perhaps we'll have another opportunity to talk further later on.
Happy to do so. You're public access, correct?
We are. We're based down in our studio is actually in Sunderland, Vermont.
Yes, I've heard of you. And actually, so I was on the board of directors of the NEK-TV in Newport for 10 years, and I've been a community producer there. So I'm a big fan of public access. So thanks for what you guys do. It's important.
Well, appreciate it, and appreciate your work and your help on that. Okay, thanks again. Have a great day. Have a good 4th of July weekend, and appreciate you making the time for us today.
Thanks. Let's do it again.
All right.
Have a great day. Thanks.